There was a college student who was asked to prepare a lesson to teach his speech class. He was to be graded on creativity and the ability to create a memorable experience, to drive home a point in a way that the students would remember. So the title of his talk was The Law of the Pendulum. And this is what he says. He says, I spent 20 minutes carefully teaching the law of the pendulum. You know what a pendulum is? It's that thing that goes back and forth when you swing it from one end to the other. So he said, a pendulum can never return to a point higher than the point from which it was released. So if you have something here that you release that goes this way, it will never come back and go higher than the point that it was released from. It will always be lower because of friction and gravity, and each time it swings back and forth, it will go less and less and less until finally it stops. So he says, I attached a 3-foot string to a child's toy top, and I thumbtacked it to the top of the blackboard, and I pulled the top to one side, and I made a mark over here where I was going to release it from, and then I let it go, and it swung over, and it swung back, and each time it came back over, I'd make a new mark on the blackboard until it went down and down and down, and finally it stopped. And the markings on my board, starting up here and going down and down, proved my thesis, that every time the pendulum swings over, it comes back at a lower height until finally it stops. So I asked the people in the classroom, I said, how many of you believe in the law of the pendulum? And all of them raised their hand, including the teacher. Yes, the law of the pendulum is true. When it swings over, it comes back, it goes at a lower height until finally it stops. But it never comes back higher than the point from which it was released. Never. So the teacher got up from the back of the room and he started coming to the front of the class thinking that my lesson was done. But it had just begun. Because hanging from a steel beam in the ceiling was a weight, a pendulum weight of 250 pounds, comprised of metal weights tied to 4 strands of 500-pound test parachute cord. So I invited the teacher to come up to the table that was against the wall, the cement wall. I had placed a chair on the table with the back against the cement wall so that his head, when he sat on it, would be against the wall. And then as he sat there, I took the 250-pound pendulum and I brought it up to his nose. And then again, I explained the law of the pendulum. And I said, if the law of the pendulum is true, then when I release this mass of metal, it will swing across the room and return short of the release point. And I said to the teacher, your nose will not be in danger. After that final restatement of the law, I looked him in the eye and I asked, sir, do you believe in the law of the pendulum? Do you believe that it's true? And there was a long pause. Huge beads of sweat formed on his upper lip, and then weakly he nodded and replied, yes. And I released the pendulum. And it made a swishing sound as it arced across the room, and at the far end of its swing, it paused momentarily and started back, and I never saw a man move so fast in my life. He literally dove off the table. So I turned to the class and I asked them, does he believe in the law of the pendulum? And their answer was a resounding no. He said he believed, but when it came to acting on his belief, he bailed. There's a saying that says actions speak louder than words. What does that mean? It means that our actions are a greater indicator of what we believe than what we say. When it comes to God and His promises for us, we say we have faith in them, but what do our actions say? We're in a series now called A Person of Faith, and in Genesis chapter 12, I'd like you to turn there. Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. Genesis 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. So last Sunday I introduced you to a man named Abram. Not Abraham yet, Abram. And I told you that he was a person of faith. So you see, he was born and he grew up in a city called Ur of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. And at one point his father Terah decided to leave Ur and move to the land of Canaan, which is about 1,200 miles away. And at the same time, God was calling Abram to go to that same place, to leave behind his family, friends, culture, and language, and go to that new land where he didn't know anyone and had no understanding of the language or the culture, and there was no one there that could make the transition easier for him. And there were already people in that land who thought it was their land. So God said, I'm promising that land to you, but Abram would be in a place of incredible vulnerability. So would he and his wife and his nephew be able to survive there? So Terah took along with him on his journey Abram and Sarai and their nephew Lot, but they only made it 900 miles to the city called Haran, and Terah, for whatever reason, decided to stop there. But the call of God on Abram was still holding, and so perhaps when Terah died, Abram decided it was time to finish the journey. Now, what's so amazing about the calling of God, not that he just called him to go to a place, was the promise that God made to Abram, that God would take him to this new land, that it would be his, that God would make him a father of a great nation, that he would be a blessing to the earth, that he would be blessed, that he would be blessed, and that people who blessed him would be blessed, and people who cursed him would be cursed. What an amazing promise. And it should have given Abram all the reassurance and the security that he needed as he faced this uncertain future. In fact, when Abram got to Canaan, he set up altars as a way to worship God, but also as a reminder as to what God had promised to him. This was now his land that God had given to him. Abram then received the promise as a person of faith. And we commended him for that last week. But then the famine came. Now, famines were quite common in the land of Canaan. In Abram's day, obviously, people were dependent on the rain for their crops to grow. But there were 5 months in the summer where there was absolutely no rain. Usually, rains then came in the fall. But if the fall produced no rain, then famines occurred, and the dry wind would come up from the south, the ground would be parched, and there was nothing growing. Well, down in Egypt, they have the Nile River, so they don't really have a problem like they did in Canaan that didn't have the Nile to supply their water needs. So what would happen is people would often leave their area and go down to Egypt when there was a famine because they were already supplied with water. And they have documented cases of people leaving from Canaan and going and settling in Egypt during a famine, and sometimes famines lasted a couple of years. So one such famine came to Canaan, and Abram and Sarai and Lot went down to Egypt. But the question is, did they really have to go? I mean, didn't God just promise Abram that he would be the father of a great nation in the land of Canaan? Couldn't he have just asked God to provide for his needs there? I mean, yes, everybody else goes to Egypt when there's a famine. Does he have to go there too? So where's the prayer? Oh God, that promised all this to me to make me a father of a great nation. I am needing you today. I humble myself before you. Please supply my needs so that I don't have to go anywhere and I can stay in this land that you have promised. Where is that prayer? Instead, he goes to Egypt. Pastor Jim Cymbala, in his book Fresh Faith, says, How else will we receive great answers from God unless we persevere in prayer? God is drawn to prayer. He delights in communion with us. Prayer releases His blessing into our lives. When God sends His divine promise, He's very grieved and saddened if His people do not believe Him. The great battle of our spiritual lives is, will you believe? It's a matter of believing that God will do what only God can do. That God will do what only God can do. The year was 1857. America was at both an economic and a spiritual low. Attendance in churches had dwindled, and there was a cynicism among many concerning religion. It was in the midst of this spiritual crisis that God gave a vision to a man by the name of Jeremiah Lanphier. And the vision that he had was of starting a noontime prayer meeting in the city of New York City. He went to great lengths to advertise, put up posters all over the place, advertised in the newspaper. There's going to be a noontime prayer meeting this day, inviting all men to come for that meeting and pray for our city. The meeting started on September 23rd, 1857, and when the doors opened at noon to that room, which was upstairs from the street, no one showed up. The minutes went by, and about 12:30, from upstairs, Jeremiah could hear a man walking up the stairs to the meeting. And by the time they started, there were 6 people there. Soon the numbers of the meeting increased, and by October 14th, over 100 people were coming to the prayer meeting. Other buildings were needed to accommodate the large numbers of people coming. Churches began to open their doors, but they were not large enough as thousands began coming to those prayer meetings. And by March of 1858, Burton's Theater, which could hold up to 3,000 people, was filled to overflowing, and soon it spilled out into firehouses and police stations and other buildings because the prayer meeting had spread like wildfire throughout the city of New York. And then it spread throughout New York State, and then New England, and then finally across the entire country. And in the revival of 1858, many, many thousands became believers in Jesus Christ. Now, the timing of that, interestingly enough, was 3 years before the American Civil War, the bloodiest war in the history of America. God, in His sovereignty, knew that thousands upon thousands of people would die in that war, and they needed to hear about Jesus Christ before that would happen, and many of them did. Jeremiah Lanphier had a faith in God, and he acted upon it. He believed that God will do what only God can do. That's faith. But the hardest part of faith is often simply to wait. And the trouble is, if we don't, then we start to fix the problem ourselves. And that sometimes makes it worse. All right, I'm not going to get a raise of hands here, guys, but how many of you have had a problem in your house? Something went wrong, plumbing, electrical, something went wrong, and you said, I don't have the ability to fix that. I'm not an expert, so I'm going to call a guy. And you called a guy, and he said, yeah, I can't come out till a week from Thursday. Okay, you called around, can't find anybody and come any sooner than that. So then you thought, well, maybe I could fix it. And you started tinkering, and these days what you did probably is you went on YouTube and, how to fix a drain or how to fix an electrical outlet, or you did one of those things, thought, well, guy's doing it right there, I'll just do it. And what happened? Before long, it became a disaster. And what was a small problem, you have created a huge problem. Why? Simply because you couldn't wait for the guy who could do it the way it needed to be done. I know I'm the only one here who has ever done that, so I'm sure none of you have ever done that. Sometimes we do that when we need to ask God for something and we get a weight from God and we say, well, I guess I'll just have to do it because God's busy today. And we complicate it to the point that it takes God much longer to fix the problem that we have created by not waiting for him in the first place. Abram, the person of faith, seems to be acting like that here. Again, where's the prayer? Where's the acknowledgement? Where's the faith? Instead, he tries to fix the problem, and he makes it worse. Verse 11. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you're my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. So as Abram and his caravan are on their way to Egypt, suddenly Abram gets a thought as he looks over at his wife. It seems that she is extraordinarily beautiful, and he doesn't just think it, but it seems that it's obvious to everyone. And he thinks to himself, as we come to Egypt, this foreign land, what if some Egyptian soldier sees my wife and how beautiful she is and wants her for himself and says, well, I'll just get rid of this guy and then I can take this woman as my own. What am I going to do to stay alive? So he explains his thought to his extraordinarily beautiful wife. And he says, I want you to do something for me. I want you to tell a lie, because this is our only way out. So when we get to Egypt, I want you to tell them that you're my sister, not my wife. And surely then they will treat me well, because in that day, if you wanted to take someone as your wife, you had to ask for her brother's consent. So if they think I'm your brother, then they will treat me well if they want you. After all, this isn't really going to be lying, because we have different mothers, but we have the same father. So just don't mention that I'm your husband, okay? Abram has a lack of faith, and he's making things worse. So rather than leading his wife to faith, he's leading her away from faith. Rather than leading his wife to obedience, he's leading her away from obedience. Again, where's the prayer? Where's the faith? Didn't it occur to him that God would do whatever is necessary in order to fulfill his promise to Abram? Why did he think that he had to lie? Verse 14. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maid servants, and camels. Well, Abram was right. I mean, the Egyptians did see Sarai as an extraordinarily beautiful woman. But what Abram did not foresee was that the news about this would spread beyond just the lowly soldiers, but made its way all the way up to the top, to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a guy who didn't need her brother's consent to take her to be his wife, so he just did. And Abram was paid for it, which is nice, but what's the problem here? With Abram's wife Sarai in Pharaoh's court, how was Abram going to be the one to start a great nation in Canaan? Abram's lack of faith is messing stuff up. And I can imagine him thinking, what have I done? Am I forcing my wife to commit adultery? Then God steps in. Verse 17. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So Abram's actions aren't just affecting him, they are now affecting other people as well. So since Pharaoh has taken this woman who is to be, in a sense, the mother of a great nation as his wife, God is now judging him for that and making him terribly sick. And he puts two and two together. You know, I wasn't sick before this Abram guy showed up. And I took his sister to be my wife. Something's wrong. And he checks it out. And he finds out that she is not his sister. She is his wife. And he says, you know, in doing this, you've made your God angry at me. So get out of here. Leave and don't come back. And they were escorted out. What a mess. And all because of Abram's lack of faith in God's promise. And yes, Abram had wealth that he would take with him, but even when he looked at that wealth, he would be reminded of his lack of faith and how he did not believe in God's promise and how he had messed up everything. And what was a small problem became a huge problem. How could he have been so foolish? Why didn't he just believe? So he gets back to Canaan, and he decides that he's going to recommit. So in chapter 13, verse 1, chapter 13, verse 1, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. God, I know I've done wrong. God, I should have believed in your promise in the first place. Yes, I should have waited. I should have let you do your thing. I said I was a person of faith, but my actions speak louder than my words. If I had only trusted you, I would not have messed things up like I did. So God, I'm recommitting myself to you like I should have done before. I'm going to be a person of faith. There was a famous tightrope walker in the 1800s. His name was Blondin, B-L-O-N-D-I-N. And as many tightrope walkers do, to prove their skill, he strung a cable across Niagara Falls. How many people have done that who are tightrope walkers? That seems to be sort of the ultimate test. Well, he did that. And as that cable was strung and there was a crowd that was gathered on the side from which he left, as they watched, he walked across Niagara Falls in that tightrope, turned around, and came back again very skillfully, very safely, and the audience applauded. And then he made a sensational offer. He said to the crowd, "Who of you believes that I could carry you on my back across Niagara Falls? Who believes I could do that?" And they all said, "Well, yeah, I believe you could do that." And then he went to the first man in the crowd and he said, "Well, how'd you like to get on my back and go across with me?" And the man said, "Not on your life." And so he went from person to person in the crowd. "Do you believe that I'm able to carry a person on my back across the tightrope, across Niagara Falls, and come back safely?" "Yes." "Are you going to do it? Are you climbing up?" "No way." Till finally he came to one man, asked him the same question. "Do you believe you want to climb up on my back?" And the guy said, "Yeah, I do." So he climbed up on Blondin's back, and together they walked across Niagara Falls and came back. Actions speak louder than words. Do you believe? Then act like it. So for those times in our lives where we said we believed, but we didn't act on it, we now are committing ourselves to being people of faith. What are you believing God for? It's time to act and not just say. Words are cheap. Actions are evidence. So what is God calling you to believe today that you need to step out in, literally step out in faith? Act on it and believe. If God has promised it, it will come to pass. It will take place. But it won't unless you act, unless you step out and act in faith. So how will you be a person of faith? I don't know what your situation is, but I'm guessing there's something in your life that God has promised to you and you have been hesitant. And He says wait and you haven't waited and you may have messed things up, or you have just said, I'm too afraid. I believe, but I don't believe. It's time to step out. It's time to act. And not be like Abram, but to be a person of faith.